joining us for our October Prop Day featuring David Steele. He'll be discussing the portraits of renowned Indiana artist T.C. Steele. I'm Liz Ellis. I'm the executive director here at the Propylaeum. And a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you have questions, can you type them in down at the bottom in the Q&A section? And we'll get to as many of those as we can after his presentation. And then also, if you would like to focus just on the speaker, if you can click the speaker view button up in the top right corner, you'll be able to see that his slideshow and he will be front and center. Prop Day has a long history at the Indianapolis Propylaeum. It's held the third Wednesday of each month, and the program features a speaker and luncheon in the club room normally. Right now, we're doing it online. We hope that you'll join us at the Prop when we're able to get together again in person next year. Propylaeum was founded in 1888 by suffragist and activist May Wright Sewall as a place where women and women's groups could meet and share ideas. We carry on that tradition today through our mission as the place that connects and celebrates women. As a nonprofit, we count on your support to provide engaging programs like Prop Day. Please take a look at our website, www.thepropylaeum.org, for all of our upcoming virtual events and to support the Propylaeum. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, David Steele. David is a lifelong resident of Indianapolis who loves music, literature, and history. He's a business executive, former college professor, U.S. Army veteran, and current board member of the Indianapolis Classical Schools, and he's a past board member of the Friends of T.C. Steele State Historic Site. Ladies and gentlemen, David Steele.
Well, thank you, Liz. I'm happy to be here today. We have a lot of slides that we're going to go through on this deck, so we'll be going through them pretty quickly, quite frankly, and then I'll entertain questions at the end. What I was trying to do was include as many representative portraits of people you probably have heard of. Many of these you have probably not seen because of the locations they're in. So I tried to be very, very selective in giving you a broad array of Steele's portraits. Many individuals I find when they think of T.C. Steele, they think of the landscape painter in Brown County. And you know, his portrait work is absolutely fascinating, and they're just beautiful. They're striking when you see them up close. Steele was in Brown County from 1907 until he passed away in 26. So think of that time period. Most of the portraits you're going to see today, all except two, were painted prior to him even moving to Brown County. So he made a living as a portrait painter, and I'll share some background on that as well. But the setup is to help you appreciate these broad array of portraits of individuals who helped shape our city. And we're also going to show one of President Ben Harrison. T.C. Steele lived for 16 years at the Tinker Mansion at the corner of 16th and Talbot, where Heron High School now is, and where the Heron Art Museum was many years ago, if you remember that. So, you know, try to think about Steele living. When we do this presentation, most of these portraits were painted in his studio at 16th in Talbot. So think about that. He had not yet bought his property in Brown County. He had not built the House of the Singing Winds yet, with the exception of two of the portraits that were painted after he moved there. So let's go ahead and get started. And this will be portraits and no landscapes or no metamor or some of those paintings that you may have seen. And this is a very brief portfolio. There are several in here, very prominent folks that the paintings weren't available for this presentation. I just didn't have time, but I'll mention a couple more that are out there you may find of interest. All right, Lorianne, let's go ahead and advance. So just some brief background. I'm going to be mindful of time because we don't have a lot of time, and I'm not going to read the entire deck to you. Many of you may know about Steele. He was born in Gosport. He's a Hoosier through and through. And his family moved to Waveland, Indiana by Turkey Run State Park, Shade State Park, when he was 5. And he lived there and went to the Waveland Institute, which many believe is why his parents moved there, because the reputation for the Presbyterian school that was very, very well regarded. In fact, people attended Waveland Academy from like 6 different states. He met his wife there, Libby, Mary Elizabeth, and she was from Rushville, Indiana, and they met at the school. I'm going to show you a portrait that he actually painted of her when he was a very young man. When he left Waveland, he and Libby got married in Rushville, and he had some commissioned portrait work, not landscape work, but we're going to stay on portraits, focus on portraits in Battle Creek, Michigan. He lived there for about 2 years, had his first 2 children there, 2 of 3 children, Rembrandt called Brant, and Margaret called Daisy, and Shirley, who was nicknamed Ted, was actually born in Indianapolis when they returned. He developed a friendship with arts patron Herman Lieber, and Lieber led an effort to help underwrite and fund Steele's study at the Royal Academy in 1880 through 1885, and we'll show a beautiful portrait he painted before he left Germany in 1884. He returned from Munich and lived at the Tinker Talbot home until 1901, when John Heron bought the property, demolished the Tinker Talbot home, and built what you see now as the Heron Art School, and then the building behind it was also built during that period of time. So he had a studio there, and most of these portraits were painted in that studio. After Tinker Talbot was purchased by the Indianapolis Art Association, Steele remained living here. He moved to 423 East St. Clair. If you know that area, that is now where the condominiums are. God, I can't think of the name of them now, but it's a large group of condominiums in that area. Renaissance Place, I think. I may be wrong on that. And then he moved to Brown County in 1907, but we're not going to talk about Brown County today. We're going to talk about his portraits that he painted at Tinker Talbot in Indianapolis during a period of time after he returned here from Battle Creek, Michigan, and in Germany. All right, let's advance, Lorianne. I also want to put a plug in for Steele's election to the National Academy of Design in 1913. A lot of individuals aren't aware of that. The National Academy is a very prestigious institution in New York City. Steele was inducted, and when you are inducted, you have to give a diploma piece. And what Steele did is he had a portrait of himself painted by Frank Tompkins, who is a well-known painter. And you can see that. That's me at the National Academy. And behind me, you can see the portrait by Tompkins that Steele donated to the Academy for his piece. And it looks very much like he did during the period of time he was living in Indianapolis. So the National Academy was located across from the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Fifth Avenue and adjacent to the Guggenheim. They have now moved to Gramercy Park. Let's advance the slide, Lorianne. When you go in, prior to moving to Gramercy Park, when you go into the National Academy off Fifth Avenue across from the Met, the entire ceiling is an arched ceiling in the entryway. It's huge, very, very impressive. And they have all the people elected to the National Academy's names etched in tiles on the ceiling. And I just wanted to show you, it's very, very enjoyable to stand there in the entryway of the National Academy, hearing the traffic rush by on Fifth Avenue in New York City and see Theodore Clement Steele's name up there. I'm not sure if they've kept this since they moved to Gramercy Park location, but again, I wanted to show you a picture of that because a lot of people have not seen that or not aware of his prestigious induction into the National Academy. All right, Lorianne. So let's talk about portraiture and portrait history. Portraits are the likeness of humans or animals, and people have been creating portraits for a very, very long time, going back to ancient Egypt. Drawn portraits, painted portraits, sculpted portraits to record the appearance of someone's essentially how this discipline emerged. The earliest portrait that we're aware of still in existence is this one by Bach, who was the chief sculptor for an Egyptian pharaoh and his wife in 1356. This portrait is actually in the Berlin Museum of Art. So you can, if you're ever in Berlin, or maybe some of you have been, you can see that portrait there. It's the first one that we have documented that's still around. So portraits may be someone's, I'm going to show you a couple examples. It may be someone's occupation. It may be the sitter may be sitting for an official commissioned portrait. We're going to show you Ben Harrison and some governors that Steele did that were official sittings for commissioned work, means they're official portrait. Or they can be someone that someone commissions for their home of their family. And there are many of those that Steele did as well. So you'll be familiar with usually the head and shoulders, although you're going to see people like James Whitcomb Riley sitting in a chair. You'll see, I'll point some things out on Ben Harrison that are personal in nature that he wanted to have shine through his portrait. So let's go ahead and advance, Lorianne. And by the way, if any of you want this deck at the end, you can email Liz and she'll be happy to send it to you. So here's an example of portraits. This is the carving by Bach from early Egyptian time. The first portrait that we know is still in existence. There, of course, we have one that everyone knows, the Mona Lisa, just a striking portrait. Here's one, I'm trying to show the variation of portraits. And here's Queen Elizabeth with a portrait of herself at Windsor Castle. Look at the size of that thing. And those of you that have been to Europe have seen paintings like that. And if you go to the Houses of Parliament, it has many like that. And then on the right, we have President Obama's official presidential portrait. I'm not sure how many of you have seen that yet, but that's his official portrait. And it's very, very interesting. He's sitting, very relaxed, with no tie on, in a chair with this flowery background. And that's very different from what we've seen with the Presidential Portraits Commission that are in the National Gallery. Most of them are, tie and very buttoned down head and shoulders look. So this is very different. And the intent here is to show you the broad array of portraiture itself, that it can be many, many things. We typically think of the Mona Lisa when we think of portraits, but be aware, starts with Bach and his carving. Big portraits, large portraits like Queen Elizabeth, and then the more progressive portraits like President Obama's official presidential portrait. All right, Lorianne. So most people, as I mentioned, know Steele by his landscapes, but portraiture was how he financially sustained himself. And, I hear many people talk about, well, Steele painted portraits because he had to survive financially. It made it sound like it was like a part-time job for him, and he just did it because he needed the money. And I think that's unfair. Steele was engaged in painting portraits, and he became the premier portrait painter in the city. In the mid-1890s, he painted virtually anyone that had any status or position in the city of Indianapolis. So I want to leave you with Steele's place in the city with painting portraits. He was sought after as a portrait painter. This was not like a part-time job. Interestingly enough, he met James Whitcomb Riley when Riley was writing the copy for signs. They met at a sign company of employment. Riley was writing the copy for the signs and Steele was painting the signs. So that's where those two individuals met. So, everyone would, that would be more Steele trying to make some money. Portraiture was a discipline that he mastered and became exceptionally good at and was sought after. On the left, we have Tinker Talbot home. It's called several things, and when you do the primary research on it, it'll be referred to as Tinker Mansion, Tinker Place, the old Tinker home, Tinker Talbot. It's there where John Herron School of Art is now, a beautiful building, now gone, of course, but that was where Steele lived and had his studio when he painted the portraits. In the middle is his studio at Tinker Talbot, and we'll see this painting on the floor a bit later. That's President Benjamin Harrison. And Steele painted 4 portraits of him, which we'll talk about here in a minute. One of them hangs in the President Benjamin Harrison presidential site. And then we have a marker that I did the research on and all the primary research to support this establishment of Indiana State Historical Marker. If you go On 16th Street in front of Heron High School, you'll see this marker out in the front. It was dedicated a couple years ago. And again, this establishes Steele's presence in that area. Of course, at the time, Benjamin Harrison lived just a couple blocks down the street. This would have been the north side of the city. And once you got to Fall Creek, that would have been all woods at that time. It was a real, hotbed of activity from May Wright Sewall to Riley to all these folks that congregate in that area in the homes, arts, and political and business community, and Herman Lieber and Clemens Vonnegut and all those folks were in that area, and hence so many historical markers in the near north side. All right, Lori Ann, let's go ahead. These are the portraits we're going to look at today. And I think it's interesting. I selected ones I thought you would like to see, may have not seen before, or there was an interesting story in connections. We have 16 of them. And I think it's interesting that so many of them are in arts and education. And people like Washington DePaul, Catherine Merrill, May Wright Sewall. So again, if you want this deck, Liz will be happy to give it to you, and you can have a copy of all these. All right, let's advance. All right, our first one is May Wright Sewall, and this is just a beautiful portrait. I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, have seen this. It hangs in the foyer at the Propylaeum. She was a friend of T.C. Steele, and they collaborated on creating the Art Institute of Indianapolis, which later became the John Herron Art Institute. When the cornerstone was set for the John Herron Art Institute, both May Wright Sewall and T.C. Steele were on the agenda, the speaker's agenda. In fact, you can find that if you go to the website. I'll give you a website later. You can go and see most of these portraits with a lot of detail. And I actually have the article clip from there shows them on the agenda. This is in a Lieber frame. Herman Lieber had a shop called the Art Emporium. He built frames and had art supplies, very well-known businessman in town. And generally T.C. Steele paintings in Lieber frames are even more valuable because it suggests that was the original frame. And some of these frames are very elaborate. When we put them on PowerPoints, we generally take the frame off because some of them are large and we want you to focus on the painting. But something that's interesting here is you'll see his signature as you're looking at the portrait of May Wright Sewall, just to the right of her pink ribbon there on her shoulder, you'll see T.C. Steele, 1899. Normally he signs his paintings, whether in a landscape or portraits, in the bottom right or the bottom left. But I think thank you very much, Lori Ann, that's helpful. And this is just a beautiful painting. So if you haven't sat and studied it, so many times it's easy to walk by these things. If you've not sat and studied it, next time you're at the Propylaeum, just stand back and look at it. It's just beautiful. Extraordinary woman, extraordinary woman. We talked about at the beginning, the Propylaeum's mission is connect and celebrate women. And there's no one more important in Indianapolis history than May Wright Sewall. I'm glad to see a historical marker now downtown with her name on it, and long overdue. All right, let's advance, Lori M. All right, now this is an interesting one. I know you haven't seen this because it's in private collection. This is Mary Elizabeth, or Libby, or Bess. She was called Libby or Bess by friends. This was T.C. Steele's first wife. He met her at Waveland Academy. He was 23 at the time he painted this. So you're going to see as we go through these how his skill advanced and his colors changed after he came back from Germany. Some of them are darker than this particular one here. They fade in the bottom into the background, whereas here you can see the definitions and the lines. Libby was the mother of his 3 children. She died at 49 of tuberculosis at the Tinker Talbot house and is buried in Crown Hill. Some of you that know Steele know of his Tennessee paintings, landscape paintings. He was there from a summer through the fall of 1899. He came back in September. And he and Daisy and Libby went to Tennessee because T.C. thought that she was suffering from the disease at the time, thought that the cool mountain air might help her convalesce, and she did not. In fact, her condition was pretty dire the entire time she was there. And then when they returned in September, she died in February. So They were married Valentine's Day. I always like that little data point. I think that's fun. And this is in private collection. You won't see Mary Elizabeth Steele paintings around because they're all closely held in the family. When Selma bequeathed the House of Singing Winds to the state of Indiana, those paintings went to family, and there's not very many. There's not very many. And this is one that's just extraordinary, I think, because of his age. It was the love of his life. It was his first marriage, and he was learning how to paint portraits at the time. So I think that's a very good example of his very early work. Okay, Lorianne. This is Catherine Merrill. Now, I did include the frame here because I wanted you to see how they look when they're in the frame. I can't get into Butler because of COVID, so I asked the curator to take a picture. This is with an iPhone, so you see the light up on the top, but I'll have a better one once COVID subsides. They're going to let me come in and take some professional portraits. This hangs in the office of the provost. It's 1890. She was quite a woman. We talk about connecting and celebrating women at the Propylaeum. My lands, this lady was extraordinary. First endowed chair in an American university, first female professor at Butler, second female professor in the United States. If you've studied anything about her, John Merrill was in Indianapolis for a period of time. She became close friends with him. Nurse in the Civil War. Her father was Samuel Merrill. And if you look at any books, many times when you look at the publisher, I know most of us don't do that, but you will see Bob's Merrill Company as the publisher. And they were downtown Indianapolis. Her father founded that company. And then Merrill Street downtown Indianapolis is named after her father. And she too is buried in Crown Hill Cemetery. This is a beautiful, look at this portrait, just beautiful. And you can start seeing, this is 1890. Is when this was painted. So you're seeing Steele's sophistication as a portrait painter already start changing from the early picture when he was 26 of Libby. All right, let's advance. James Whitcomb Riley, this is Indianapolis Art Museum. Look at him sitting in a chair. When you look at portraits, I like to know something about the individual and their accomplishments in life or their impact. Riley has on his trademark glasses. He looks very casual. He's sitting there in a chair pushed forward a bit. And in portrait painting, sometimes the person sitting for the portrait decides how they want to be represented, or suggestions are made by the painter or who's ever commissioning the paintings, such as the state of Indiana and the governor's portraits may want them to be more official, sitting in a chair with some kind of official background. So that's all situational. He was, part of the big four of golden age of Indiana literature. He, Tarkington, George A. Meredith Nicholson, also Jean Stratton Porter, another extraordinary woman who just doesn't get celebrated and recognized enough in Indiana and Indianapolis. I know people that know her work, know about her, but boy, she's one of those people who's made a broad impact. And of course, Lew Wallace, who wrote Ben-Hur. I think it's interesting that Riley eulogized Harrison and Lew Wallace at their funerals, and he was a good friend of Steele's. And like I say, they first started painting together, or working together at a sign shop in Indianapolis to pay the bills. When he died, 35,000 people filed past his casket. I mean, that's a man who had an impact, and he too is buried in Crown Hill, the highest spot in Crown Hill. Some of you, if not all of you, have probably been there. Okay, Lorianne, let's advance. Here we have Clemens Vonnegut Sr. Clemens Vonnegut immigrated to the U.S. from Germany. He was the great-grandfather of writer Kurt Vonnegut Jr., started Vonnegut Hardware, which was still in business when I was a boy growing up in Indianapolis. Extremely well-respected, founding member of the Freethinkers Society. These guys were very progressive in ideas about education and ideas about women's suffrage and science and theology and government. And if you go back and read any of their papers, these guys were the real deal. I mean, guys like Clemens Vonnegut helped shape, and May Wright Sewall and Jean Stratton Porter. These folks really shaped a lot of how some of the thoughts developed during that period of time. Vonnegut served on the board of school commissioners for 28 years. And if you see this picture in its frame, actually the sign tag says, Board of School Commissioners, City of Indianapolis, 28 years. In fact, that's where I got that description. So he was clearly very proud of that. And it's not clear what he has in his hand there. It appears to be a letter. And this painting is huge, 35 by 27. That has a large frame on it. And when you see, the first time I saw this, we brought it over for the dedication of the marker at Heron on 16th Street, the one marker I just showed you, because Clemens Vonnegut son designed that building, designed the art museum. So we wanted a Vonnegut painting in there. And this looks real. When you stand in front of this painting, it looks like he is sitting there live. It's pretty remarkable. This is currently in the collection of Indianapolis Public Schools. It's actually in storage out in their warehouse. Unfortunately, I'm trying to get them to get this thing out in the public where people can see it. All right, let's advance, Lorianne. Now this person, Charles Emmerich, Emmerich Manual High School, referred to as Manual. He was the first principal. Again, look at the dimensions of this, 49¼ inches by 41¼ and it has a frame. It is just huge, and it's hanging in the auditorium, or next to the auditorium at Manual High School. Still there, and I photographed, well, I had a professional photographer do this about 4 months ago, and he was hired by A.C. Shortridge, who started the, Shortridge High School is named after him. Shortridge was the first high school in the city. And Shortridge read an article that Charles Emmerich had published about this manual training movement and, the skills of the hands and the mind and compulsory education, all those kinds of things, and wanted to interview him. So he interviewed him and hired Emmerich to essentially lead the second high school in the city, which was Manual High School, and using this manual training movement philosophy. An interesting note, his son Max Philip Emmerich was an Olympic gold medalist at the St. Louis Games. He and his family are buried on a family plot in Crown Hill Cemetery. This guy looks larger than life in this painting, doesn't he? And when you do the research on him, he was just an extraordinary man. All right, let's advance, Lorianne. Here we have William Fletcher. This painting is hanging at the Indiana Medical Museum at the former Central State grounds on the near east side, or west side, I'm sorry, off Washington Street. When you go in, if any of you have been there, when you go into the old classroom, which is almost exactly the way it was when they were teaching courses there in the late 1800s, this painting hangs on the wall. He was quite a progressive guy, advocate for public and mental health, abolishing physical constraints. I mean, that's way ahead of his time. Moral treatment of the mentally ill. He had a demonstration where they burned more than 500 straitjackets and similar devices and bonfires. He was born in Indianapolis and the son of Calvin Fletcher. And of course, all of you know probably Fletcher Place and some of the history behind Calvin Fletcher. He also served in the Civil War. The Union Army is taken prisoner and was actually released or reprieved by General Lee. So quite a history when you do the research and look at the historical papers of the Historical Society and other organizations that have their papers. Again, let me see, I got something popped up on my computer here. Okay, and again, he's buried in Crown Hill. There's a whole story about Crown Hill as well that could be a presentation. I mean, it's just full of everyone that changed this city at the turn of the century. And James Whitcomb Riley, I'm trying to make lots of connections between the portraits I selected. Riley was an honorary pallbearer. Okay, Lorianne, let's advance. Here we have L.S. Ayres, Lyman Ayres, who came who established, L.S. Ayres dry goods stores by an acquisition. And 2 years later, he bought his partners out and it became known as L.S. Ayres and Company. I'm sure many of you have shopped there when Ayres was such a part of Indianapolis. And, a lot of people say it was as famous and part of Indianapolis as Monument Circle, the Indianapolis 500. You may recall visiting Santa Claus or having lunch at the tea room. And again, Lyman Ayres is buried in Crown Hill Cemetery. Interestingly enough, while I have Monument Circle noted on here, G.C. Steele was on the committee that helped design Monument Circle. Now, when I say design, he wasn't sitting down at a drawing table and drawing, potential candidates. He was on the committee. So again, when you research Steele, you find out he was involved in about everything involved in the arts during the period of time he lived here and beyond. Okay, let's advance. Here we have Washington DePauw. Washington DePauw is a very wealthy businessman, and he ended up giving a wealth of money to DePauw University, and as a result, they ended up naming the university after him, which was previously called Asbury College. Steele lived in Waveland, which is, I don't know, 20 miles, I guess, probably from DePauw at the most. And he dabbled around with getting to know this Professor Tingley, who was at DePauw, and actually took his first painting lessons at DePauw. So I wanted this one in here because when Steele first learned to paint it with any kind of technical ability, it was at DePauw. So DePauw is a very important part of the Steele story. You know, a lot of people tell folklore stories about Steele and how he learned to paint and out in the fields and ribbons flying off his plow and those kinds of things. And, you know, some of that may be true, but we do know from primary research that he did study under Tingley and then commissioned to paint his two children. And when that came about, he was also asked to paint a picture of DePauw, who was a trustee, and the university had been named after him at that time. He is the only one, I think he is the only one out of the portraits I selected that's not buried at Crown Hill. He's buried in New Albany, which is where the geography where he came from. Okay, let's go ahead and move forward, Lorianne. Now, this is important because Steele painted 5 governors in a row. They're official portraits. All 5 of these still hang in the state capitol. Porter was the first one, then Gray, then Hovey, then Chase, and then Claude Matthews. He also painted Governor Morton, who we call our Civil War governor, but that was not Morton's commission portrait. But if you go on our website, which is at the end of this, you can see the painting of Morton, you know, big, strong, presence, very dark picture. Whereas in this one, you noticed in Manuel and Emmerich, or Charles Emmerich, his painting at the bottom sort of faded into the background. Porter, you can see the chair very, very clearly over on his right side. And then where his legs are, you see that sort of faded out. And people that study paintings, you know, call this or refer to this influence as Steele's German training at the Munich Academy as part of the way he painted these portraits. Some of them you'll see a little bit more definition as the point around the bottom. Okay, let's go ahead and advance. Here we have President Harrison. Now, Harrison was a devoutly religious man. He's sitting at a table with a Bible. And remember, we talked about portraits many times. The sitter wants a particular image created, or they want something in the picture with them. Or in the case of Barack Obama, he wanted a very progressive look to his official portrait. So you'll see these done many ways. There were 4 portraits painted of Harrison by Steele. And he, again, is buried in Crown Hill with his wife, Caroline, referred to as Carrie, who was very progressive herself. Daughters of the American Revolution, very active. When we talk about connecting and celebrating women at the Propylaeum, Caroline Harrison is one of those women who also made an impact. I don't have a portrait of her. To my knowledge, I don't know that Steele painted her. I can't find one I can't find that he did. So let's advance, Lorianne. This is an interesting one, a bit different in the sense that, you know, portraits are generally someone sitting in a chair like we've seen Riley or Governor Porter. This is the Pierce children, and they were sons and daughters of a prominent family in Indianapolis. Henry Douglas Pierce was a lawyer and businessman, And they lived 1400 block of North Meridian Street. If you go on the website where I have much more information, you'll actually see a picture of their house on Meridian. The Blue Book, which was sort of the social society book, around the turn of the century, you guys probably have heard of Blue Books. They were listed as members of the Art Association of Indianapolis. So again, we talk about these connections to these paintings. You can start seeing these people all knew each other, or they all participated in some of the same circles and same activities. And was a member and officer for many years at the Indianapolis Propylaeum. I think it's a very interesting painting. We have Henry Douglas, or we have, I'm sorry, the children. I thought I put in here which ones were, no, I didn't. I thought I had their ages in here, but clearly the son is on the left. I'm not sure what's next, what's behind him there on the floor. But again, dressed in period clothes, this would have been, and you see the dark fading on the left side, which would have been Steele's Munich training, where it's a little more defined at the bottom and the top. So this is very unusual portrait that I think, oh, I see, I have it at the top. Henry Douglas Pierce is on the left and Teresa is on the right. Okay, let's go ahead and advance. Here we have Steele's third child, Ted. He was referred to as Ted, and his mother's maiden name was Lakin, Mary Elizabeth Lakin, Libby, Steele's first wife. So that's where that name comes from. And Shirley was born, or they called him Ted, was born in Indianapolis after his parents returned from Battle Creek for Steele's first commissioned work. Steele had two other children that died in infancy, so there were 5 children, and these were the 3 surviving children. Interesting that Shirley attended Manual High School. Manual is the school that Charles Emmerich was the first principal of, so in the first school that was of the hand and the mind. Another interesting thing about Manual High School and the history there is J. Otis Adams Otto Stark of the Hoosier Group taught painting at Manual High School. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but there's lots of connections between these portraits and the people and their activities, lots of connections. He died, Ted died in California. He was a secretary for the water district there, and was married, died at 72, and met his wife here. They moved to California. He had one child. I'm sorry. Margaret, his only child, did not have any children. She never married, but I found a lot of information on where she lived in her life. Not a lot, but I found her obituary in another article, and she worked for the Red Cross in California. And Shirley and or Ted and Margaret or Daisy are both buried in California. So Shirley didn't have children and Margaret did. She had, I think, 2 sons, maybe 3, who were in the LA area, and then they have offspring. So there are some Steeles out on the West Coast. All right, let's advance. We'll be finished up here very quickly. This is Daisy, T.C. Steele's daughter. She was the middle child, again, born in Battle Creek. She married Gustav Neubacher, who was Selma Neubacher's brother. Selma was T.C. Steele's second wife, and when you go down to Brown County to the House of Singing Winds, that's who lived with Steele there. In fact, he married Selma and took her down to the house either the day they were married or the next day after, and that was her first sight of the or took her down to the property. So when you hear a lot about Selma, because you hear a lot about Steele's time in Brown County, because when that property was bequeathed to the state, it's just like the day they were living there. So it gets a lot of play. But remember, he did a lot of work here in Indianapolis prior to his time down there, and all these portraits were essentially done here. She left, Daisy left Indianapolis, and they both settled in the Oakland area, her and Shirley, her brother Ted, and they're both buried there. Shirley had, Daisy had three children, as I said, out in the LA area. This is when we look at the painting, see her big hat, and she's sitting in a chair, and we'll notice that the background here is very light. So this was 1891. Steele came back from Germany in 1885. So, you know, this doesn't show the dark German trained fading that you see in the other ones. And you can see his signatures up there in the top right, which is different. All right, let's advance, Lorianne. This is Bona Thompson. I don't know if you've heard of Bona Thompson. This is an interesting story. She was a daughter of a wealthy man who sent his wife and daughter to Indianapolis so she could go to college, so Bona could go to college. And she went to Butler, which was located in Irvington at the time. And the last remaining building from Butler in Irvington is the library. And that is still, you know, the way it was when Butler was in Irvington. And it is now named the Bona Thompson Memorial Center. So if you want to know the history of that, her parents, Bona took a trip to Europe, and when she returned, she had an illness and eventually was diagnosed as typhoid fever, and she passed away, unfortunately, at 21 years of age. Her parents, devastated, they gave $40,000 cash to fund the construction of the library building in her memory, and it still stands today. So if you haven't gone out to see it, go out and see that building. It's in a beautiful neighborhood. And then they named a street after her just south of Irvington Circle, named Bona Avenue. And it runs along the railroad track there. And the railroad surveyor, when he was told the name, he was told Bona, and he spelled it the way it sounded. So it's never been changed. But that when you see Bona Avenue, that's named after Bona Thompson. Her portrait, I think, again, she's sitting there casually with a elbow and hand propped up on her head. You can see a chair in the background, table, beautiful dress, young lady, hair tied up and very well presented for this portrait sitting. And I think this is in the Great Books room at Irwin Library at Butler. So when COVID is over and you can get back in the library, this would be one I would encourage you to go see. All right, let's advance. And I think this is our last one, Liz. This is, I saved this to last because it's sort of like the Mona Lisa. You know, we don't really know for sure who she is, although the Mona Lisa had a name. This just has the Munich Model. He painted this in 1884. He returned after his 5 years of study in Munich in 1885. It is signed and dated on the lower left. You can actually see it pop out there. This is in the collections of, thank you, Lorianne. This is in the collection of the Indianapolis Museum of Art. The late author, William Gertz, who's written on Steele, he says, in fact, I'll just read this. In this 3/4 length figure study, Steele does not highlight the sitter's face in the customary manner. Remember, we talked about that, but instead concentrates on the light on her white blouse. The striking illumination emphasizes the diagonal created by the chair and the model's arm, adding a dynamic quality to the composition. The dramatic lighting also emphasized the contrast between the sitter's white blouse and the richly textured Asian rug covering the chair. I just love that statement. And when you look at this painting in person, it is like that, you know, I talked to all of them are striking. But I talked about the Vonnegut, Clemens Vonnegut seems real when you're sitting there looking at him. This is the same way. When you're sitting there, she looks like she's actually there in person. And look at the detail on the Asian rug there, the light, how the light's cast on her face and the shadow on her neck. And then the top left, we see the fading, which people have studied Steele's portraits suggest came from his Munich training, although we did see it absent in the portrait of Daisy. So unfortunately, Gertz, very, very well known. He lived in New York, and he just died of COVID, unfortunately, this year at 92, I think, esteemed professor of art, so New York City University. All right, let's advance. Here, I just wanted to show you a picture of the old Tinker Talbot building or house where Steele lived. And he lived here when he returned from Germany and started painting the portraits to help pay back for the trip that Lieber helped solicit sponsorship for. And the last paragraph's important, I believe. It's noteworthy. So when he came back, he moved in the spring into Tinker Talbot, and he completed 14 portraits over the next 10 years, establishing himself as the city's premier portrait artist. Let's go ahead and advance. I wanted to show you this because a portrait I can't find, so if you know where it's at or you run into it, please let me know. Herman Lieber was an established person here in this city and was involved in everything that went on at that particular time. And without Herman Lieber, we wouldn't have had an arts movement and May Wright Sewall. It was, Lieber's money, Sewall's vision, Steele's contribution. I sort of call those three personally the big three of the arts movement in Indianapolis. When we look at this article, it says, this is Lieber's funeral. At the entrance to this room hung the 3/4 length portrait of Mr. Lieber, recently painted by T.C. Steele and presented to the German house by friends. So that's got to be somewhere. We can't seem to find anyone that knows anything about it. Many times portraits, everyone, they have been put in either an institution somewhere like Bona Thompson, where if somebody didn't tell you it's in the Great Books Hall, you wouldn't know it or you wouldn't go seek it out. Or they're in private ownership of the family. We just found a painting of two individuals, prominent people in Indianapolis. I don't have permission to release them yet, but we will soon. And a guy in Boston has them and has two paintings of his mother and his father. And they were, like I say, very prominent citizens. So again, when you look down here, we see the funeral committee. I mean, my lands, we had Clemens Vonnegut, and we had Harvey Bates, we had T.C. Steele, were all, and Clemens Vonnegut Jr. were on the funeral committee for Lieber's funeral. Then they had this huge portrait that I would love to see, 3/4 length of Lieber at the funeral. So I thought you might find that interesting as well. I'm trying to connect all these dots. Steele would have never gone to Germany had it not been for Lieber. Indianapolis would not have had an arts movement without May Wright Sewall and Lieber shepherding that and pushing that forward. And then John Herron coming up with the $250,000 gift to build the building that Kurt Vonnegut's grandfather of Vonnegut and Bowen Architects design, which is still there where it houses Herron High School. All right, Lorianne, can you advance? This is a picture. We showed this earlier, and Liz, I'm just about done. This is Steele in his studio at Tinker Talbot. We see the picture of Ben Harrison, or the portrait of Ben Harrison there on the floor. Remember, he painted for them. One of them is in the National Portrait Gallery. Very important. Steele's work, not only was he inducted into the National Academy, he also has a portrait that he painted of a president in the National Portrait Gallery. I love this picture here. You can see the old wallpaper on the wall and some of his materials sitting around his easel. Okay, let's advance, Lorianne. So I'd like for you, encourage you to visit the Friends of T.C. Steele virtual gallery. There's the website at the bottom. We have 80 paintings up now. They represent his full genre of, and during these three main periods of his painting, the Munich period, Brookville, Brown County. So he also painted Vermont, Tennessee, and Oregon. I have all those paintings up there, and we add to them. We have 6 in queue now. We try to put one up a week or every other week, and we also have a mailing of a painting called the Artist Steele that we send out. And if you want to be on that mailing list, we only send one out about once a month. And it's just one of those paintings that we think people might enjoy that like Steele, and our newsletter, which is very brief and includes some interesting articles in it. Just let Liz know and she can send me the information. We'll add you to our mailing list. Promise you won't get much. All right, let's advance. So thanks to Liz and her team for having me. You can email Liz if you'd like a copy of this presentation, just provide the appropriate credit at the bottom. I noticed a couple of typos in there. I'm sorry about that when you put these things together and you're cutting and pasting and looking at, all kinds of data and newspaper articles. Sometimes there's an error, and if there were some, I saw a couple of them. I apologize for that. And I thank you. I'm happy to entertain any questions if we have time, Liz.
David. Yeah, we do have a few questions. We have just a couple minutes, so we won't be able to get to all of them. How are you related to T.C. Steele?
So T.C. Steele, it starts with Ninian Steele, who is buried in the old Cerber Cemetery in Gosport, Indiana. So that would be T.C. Steele's great-great-grandfather. It'd be like my great-great-great-grandfather. And he had a son, and that son had two sons. And I come down one side, and T.C. Steele comes down the other side. So distant, but still, we all go back to Ninian Steele.
Okay. Besides the historic site in Brown County, are there other places around the state related to Steele? We know that the Tinker House is no longer there. Are there other places that the public can visit?
You bet. There's nothing at DePauw because the original DePauw campus just doesn't exist anymore. But you should drive around DePauw and just have the presence of knowing that Steele, trotted through those grounds. The T.C. Steele Boyhood Home, where he lived from 5 till when he graduated from Waveland Academy and married Libby, is fully renovated. Actually, my cousin Tim Shelley and his wife Meg own it. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. If anyone would like to see that house, again, email me and we could find a way to do that. It's in private ownership and no one lives there on a daily basis, but arrangements can be made. It's just beautiful. And while someone's there, they should go to Shade State Park, which Steele painted as a young man in Shade State Park. And also, T.C. Steele's father, Samuel, is buried in the cemetery there, as well as his grandfather, James Armstrong Steele, are buried in the cemetery. And the Carnegie Library in Waveland, Indiana, has a Steele painting in it that Steele gifted to the library, the Carnegie Library, the day it opened. So it's a little tiny town in Waveland. There's a fair amount of Steele history. 16th Street at Tinker Talbot, you can see the historical marker there where his house was. You can walk around, see Benjamin Harrison's home, the Propylaeum, all the wonderful architecture in that area. And then another important place is the Hermitage in Brookfield. The Hermitage is a historic home that's now a bed and breakfast, and Steele lived there with J. Otis Adams. They bought the house when they were painting in Brookville and Metamora. So that would be somewhere you could go stay overnight. The innkeeper's wonderful. She has T.C. Steele painting. And the studios that Steele built is still there with stained glass that his son Rembrandt put in there. So that would be a place to go. And then Franklin Hall in IU, when he was honorary professor of painting, you can't go in there, but there is a historical marker that will be placed outside the Franklin Hall. It's in the queue. It's been approved by the president of IU. And so we're going to create something called the T.C. Steele Historic Trail. And if you go on our website, the tcsteele.org, and go up, I can't think it's like visit, and there's a drop down called Historic Trail. This is conceptual now, but someday when you ask that question, we'll say yes, and here are the things you can do. We'll have a little passport.
Okay, and one last quick question. Are there ways that the public can get involved?
You bet. Steele was an extraordinary man, and I think so many people only know about Steele and his life in Brown County and his landscape painting. He was an intellectual. He was sought after for his view and opinion of things, like being on the Monument Circle Design Committee. Very, very well read, very good friends with politicians and business people. So the best way to get involved is the Friends of T.C. Steele is a support group, and we have some very noble goals ahead of us, such as the T.C. Steele Historic Trail. And we would love for individuals who might be interested in being on our board to contact us. And again, you can do that by going to the website, www.tcsteele.org. And I saw a note pop up, Liz. Somebody asked if the Athenaeum German Club are one and the same, and they are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And is Carl Hermann Lieber, was that his real name, his full name?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
Sometimes you'll see it spelled with 2 N's or 2 A's, and that's not correct. It's Harman. And he was quite a guy, and all of us that love art, we can thank him and May Wright Sewall, and then T.C. Steele being sort of the subject matter expert in that group.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, David. We really appreciate it. Thanks for coming and taking the picture of May Wright Sewall. We're very proud to have that here. That's all. We really appreciate your taking the time out of your day to join us. David, we really appreciate your program. Thank you so much.